Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar, and welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce the Book of Everlasting Things with Aanchal Malhotra in conversation with Vivek Tejuja. Aanchal Malhotra's latest novel, The Book of Everlasting Things, is an evocative tale steeped in Indian perfumery, Urdu calligraphy, and a romance that defies time and space. A love story set against the backdrop of the partition, it follows the journey of two apprentices as they fall in love with their respective ancient crafts and each other amidst a turmoil. This session will be held in conversation with Vivek Tejuja. I'm delighted to introduce our first guest. Aanchal Malhotra is a writer and oral historian from New Delhi. Her critically acclaimed books, Remnants of a Separation and In the Language of Remembering, explore the human history and generational impact of the 1947 partition. Her newest work is a debut novel titled The Book of Everlasting Things. Joining her is Vivek Tejuja, the author of So Now You Know, Growing Up Gay in India, a memoir. His second book, Strange Bedfellows, is out in 2023. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. And it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Aanchal. Hi.
Hey.
All right, so let's begin. First of all, I just want to tell everyone sitting here that, contrary to popular belief, Aanchal's book is not a partition novel. It's a love story, and partition is just a backdrop, or it happens to be a part of it. It's not it, all right? So just trying to clarify that because I've been hearing that over and over again that it's a partition novel, but it's not. Now that's out of the way, so let's begin. All right, Aanchal, tell me, as a historian, how difficult or easy was it for you to write fiction? And in that process, when you're talking about historical fiction per se, because this book spans about 80 years or 70 years, and then you have to include facts in the book as you go along and make it like a skeletal framework, and characters do what they do in and around that time frame. So how was it for you as a historian to make that jump from non-fiction to fiction?
It's a great question and something I think about a lot, and I think anyone that has ever switched genres in their writing career, even temporarily, has to address at some point how much do you carry on from where you've come to where you've gone, and how much do you leave behind. For me, there are positives and negatives because I came from the world of non-fiction to fiction, and when you are trained as a historian, I think it's very interesting. I'm trained as a historian in the subject that I'm also writing fiction about. So in that sense, it gives me the nuance and the specificity of detail that perhaps someone who has not had that training would not have. Hardly any historical novelists have been professional historians as well. So that's a pro, obviously. But I think the training as a historian is also a con because how much of history is too much history? You mentioned it's a skeletal framework, but sometimes it becomes quite overwhelming to think about what to leave behind and what to include. But your larger question of why fiction? Why move? I've been recording oral histories of partition for 10 years now, since 2013. And one of the things when you are on the receiving end of people's real stories, you realize that it's such a privilege to be recording those stories. But you cannot move those stories around. You can't deviate from what you have received. You can only interpret it, and you can draw parallels to other stories of the same way. So you're drawing memory patterns in a way. That's the kind of oral history I do with partition. Somewhere along the line, because I had garnered so much information about partition from various sides of the border, I felt the need to write a story that would draw from reality, draw from the framework of history, but to be able to create characters that would assimilate into that landscape, which is really historical fiction, to create an opening within history, and because history is quite malleable, it has space for us to insert fictional characters and make them real enough to be absorbed into that landscape. But it's very hard. I would say it's a real challenge. Like, there was writing fiction is incredibly challenging, and I have immense respect for novelists. Like writing history, nonfiction is also hard, but I found the transition very, very challenging.
Also in that, the subject of the book, right? When you're talking about things like perfume, you're talking like about calligraphy, and then you're speaking about lovers who get torn apart and set in, and they are made to like sort of live in different countries in that sense. So how does that come about, and why did you specifically you know choose perfumery and calligraphy when there are other art forms, there's other places to look at? So why these two? And that I kept thinking throughout the book while reading it as well. So
The beginning of the idea of the novel came from a story my mother told me many years ago in passing. It wasn't like she really delivered it to me with great importance. She said that her father, my grandfather, used to work for Dabur, which is a pharmaceutical company, and he used to make soaps, shampoos, stuff like that. But he was given all of these perfume samples, like papaya extract and rose extract, aloe vera, stuff like that. And whatever he wouldn't use, he would come home, and in the summertime, the cooler in the house, the grass cooler, he would put whatever perfume remained in the water of the cooler. So the whole house would smell of rose, or it would smell of oranges or papaya. And this little kernel of memory became, I guess, the beginning of the story about a family that was surrounded by perfume, a family that was imbued with perfume on an everyday basis, hence the perfume. Calligraphy, I think, is because I'm trained as a printer. And I have a lot of love for the way in which not just printing happens, but language changes from mechanized printing to hand, and just love for the handmade. So, but even then, like, I didn't know how to do calligraphy. So there was a lot of research required there on how to even hold a kalam, or how to press down on it, or the sound that it makes, how much ink to draw from your inkwell. In general, I think I gravitate to things that require a slower pace of life. So these arts of perfumery and calligraphy that are now kind of becoming invisible because things are so automated, it is also a chance to celebrate that, in my opinion.
you spoke about slower pace of life, and the book is set in a time when things were actually at a slower pace. And then to go and do research on all of that, especially Lahore and Paris, and what they would wear, what they would eat, how they would speak. How much time did that take, and how did you go about that? Because a lot of this book is simply only seeped in so much research. So I want to talk to you about that as well.
That's an occupational hazard. The book starts in the Lahore, around 1930s in Lahore, and moves through to a post-war Europe, to France, and then moves back in time to Grasse and the trenches of the First World War, and then moves to present day and ends eventually in 2017 in Paris. So a lot of the book is about landscape. And the research for the book took about 5 years in total. And I don't think that I can really write about a place without going to that place. So it meant visits to Lahore, which, of course, for my partition work were also helpful. But I think particularly, Lahore was particularly important because it is possible to visit France and other places quite easily. But to go across the border and do research in a place that so many people, especially in India, will probably never see in their lifetime, and is surrounded by so much myth and stereotype. And to go there, to walk there, there are scenes in the book that are taken directly from me walking on the soil and searching and researching and drawing from the landscape around me. But I think it's very important for you to write an authentic text. If it's possible for you to travel to the places, then you should, because it's not just about the images you see or the architecture of the place. It's very much about the sight and smell and sound and language and the difference also with where you came from and where you are right now. I think that was very important for me to record as well.
Also, when you speak of authenticity of text, there's also the detailing that went on in this book in terms of the prose. It's languid, it's floral, it's and you make it a point to make it that way. Was that intentional? Did you want it to be, because dialogues are interspersed, but they are also far and few, and in between somewhere the prose that exists, like when they enter the perfume shop for the first time for those and a family, and when you're talking about Paris or when you're talking about World War I, there's this huge prose that the reader has to sort of go through and imbibe it and think over and gloss over so much, because that's what happened to me. I had to keep thinking and going back again, sometime. So was that, how does that work as a historian versus a fiction writer? Because there's that always that balancing act, right?
Absolutely. And I don't know. I mean, I think I'm still learning how to do it, but it was very important for the language of the book to reflect the language of the time. So in some cases, especially when you're talking about the Lahore of 1930s or 1940s, or even a little bit earlier in memory, the language is archaic because people thought in a very different time than we do now. The language is a bit romantic. When you talk about perfume is such an extraordinary thing because it's invisible. And it makes up, I would say, quite a large part of the book because my protagonist is a perfumer. He's constantly thinking about things that are invisible. Smell is something you cannot touch, and yet the vocabulary of perfume and perfumistic engagement is so specific. It is so specific to be talking about a particular kind of smell. What is floral? What is soft? Why is a rose milky? Why is a rose powdery? These things are things that ordinary people that have not been trained as perfumers may not understand. But again, the authenticity of text, and I think this comes from me being a historian. I wanted everything to be so precise. So whether it is a newspaper article or a day in which a battle takes place, or even soldiers walking to the battlefield, or a fire, or a news broadcast, I wanted all of these to be real, which I think is a very difficult thing to do because you're constantly, again, grappling with how much information is too much information.
Precisely, right. I mean, did you ever think as point of a reader? Because sometimes that also happens. Will the reader be able to take all this information in?
I don't think this is a novel to be hurried through, though. That's not my intention. My intention is to actually, when you're reading it, to be absorbed into the page. You have to agree with the pace of the novel. It is slow because it's meant to be slow and it's meant to be savored. And smell and tactile things, texture, they evoke memory, and you're supposed to think. I think, as you describe, when you're reading, it may evoke something else because it is a visceral book, in my opinion, at least.
Just to change the track a little bit, of course, but sticking to the book, is the character of Vivek, again, my namesake, and that's why I feel a little affinity towards him. But Vivek goes to war. There's World War I that takes place, and he's there. And then towards the end, someone chances upon his journal, Samir. And that completely broke me because that nobody speaks of. It's not written, it's not documented, you don't go searching for it. It's about men who go to war and their experience of it and what happens to their mind, to their heart, to their souls. So, where did that come from? That you had to talk about that, because that comes right as a plot point towards the end. But of course, at the beginning, you're talking about him going to war.
Well, there was a panel here about India and First World War, which I hope people attended because it was very informative. But the Indian involvement in the First World War is not something that people in this subcontinent really discussed probably before the centenary. It is with the centenary of the war in 2014 that real interest grew in colonial troops, including the Indians from undivided India. When I was doing research on Partition, I spoke to a lot of people who had served in World War II, men and women. And they spoke with fondness about their fathers and grandfathers, because in World War I, it was only men who were allowed to be in battle, whereas in World War II, women also played roles. They talked about their ancestors being in war, and my first reaction was, wait, what? I didn't know that 1.5 million Indian troops had fought in the First World War, and I don't think a lot of people still know that. So I think this kind of little bit of information stuck in my head, and I used the character of Vivek as really in my opinion, he's the thread that runs through the book, because of course you follow him into battle and you follow him returning home, but then you also follow him through his journals that he writes. And the reason why he writes journals is because when the Indian soldiers went to war in 1914, they were writing something like 15,000 to 20,000 letters a week. about everything, about adventure, about how incredible the weather was, about women, about how animals were used in the farmlands. And then the war happened, and they went to battle, and they realized that actually they were not there for some adventure. They were there in a way to fight on, well, as cannon fodder, but to fight in these trenches that they'd never been in a weather they'd never experienced. And their shades of feeling changed. And they knew very well that their letters were being censored, so they could write only so much. In a way, if you read some of the letters, they also use code words, right, when they send letters home, because the British officers were reading them, which is also why we have those letters, because they were translated. But when Vivek writes in his journal, it is what he feels from his heart. When he says that every day I see Indian soldiers dying for European, white, Angrez officers, but I've never seen the opposite. He means it because he sees it. When he says that we have sacrificed ourselves for 11 rupees, that's what they got per month. He means it because he's seen it. He is the son of a cloth merchant. And his father told him, you're not made for battle. And he never agreed with it because he wanted that kind of adventure. So he goes to war. And when he writes to his father, you were right, I should have listened to you. That things like this were things that people wrote in their letters, because what they thought war was going to be was not what it eventually turned out to be. And the trauma and the memory that people carried, I think we will never entirely know how they felt. But I thought in some way it is very important to honor those that went to war, of course, but also how it impacted the families in their absence, which is what happens with Vivek's family, and how his returning to Lahore after battle kind of changes the trajectory of the family.
Also, grief that plays such a permanent fixture in the book throughout, right? From the beginning to the end. And yet, your characters, perhaps they know they want to express grief and loss, but they are unable to do so. It's always bottled, like a perfume whose name I don't know and I don't want to know. However, how did you deal with that as a novelist? That to hold back, to not express. Even the grief is sort of languid and it's just there. It stays somewhere inside.
It's a reflection of reality, isn't it? Like, how many times in our own life do we feel that we need to confront something or tell someone something and we don't find the words? We have no vocabulary for grief, and if it is, it's not always verbal. There are so many other ways to denote so many things we feel. And I learned this actually because I spent so much time talking to people about the things they had lost during partition, and how they were unable to discuss those things often in language, how touch became one of the ways in which you I suppose you speak about loss and grief, or how you talk about regret or sadness. I think it's a very human way, right? We don't always have words. So I think in this sense, characters, they keep to themselves, they keep secrets, they make little vessels of their lives that other people have to belatedly find by chance and open up and discover. And I think when you chance upon a grief of an ancestor, you don't quite know what to do with it, particularly if the ancestor is long gone. And you're lost because you're trying to make sense of an event that you have not witnessed, of a secret that's not yours, but you have inherited belatedly. And I think that happens to my main character, Samir, a lot. His life changes when he says something like, I have inherited the heaviness of old,
I would just want you to read portions from your book so that they get an idea of what the book is about.
I try and read a bit of one happy section and one sad section. But to be fair, this book is actually quite sad. So
That I vouch for.
yeah, bring tissues. Okay, the first section I'll read is at the beginning when Samir, my main protagonist, he's 9 or 10 years old, he's very young, and he's being just drafted into the business as a perfumer's apprentice. His uncle had once told him that he was capable of experiencing smell. Perhaps this is what he meant: to feel it, to live it, to have a bodily reaction to it. Closing his eyes, he inhaled the citrus once again and felt his tongue reach out and instinctively touch the roof of his mouth, filling it with saliva. He pictured his mother Savitri in the kitchen of Vij Bhavan slicing raw lemons and squeezing out their juice with her bare hands. He thought of the totems made with lemons and green chilies hanging outside the Hindu shops of Anarkali. He imagined lying under the summer sun, chewing lemon and mint crushed on ice, chomping on roasted peanuts, onions, tomatoes splashed with lemon, eating boiled white rice or salted chapatis squirted with fresh lemon. A mere whiff created an endless montage. Fragrance possessed the power to provide instant, pure pleasure. Quicker even than sight or sound, it penetrated Samir's senses, transporting him simultaneously to multiple places with each whiff. And then the second section is more towards the middle of the book. During Partition, a tragedy strikes that leaves Samir quite alone, and he makes his way across the world to France. And there he sits in this apartment and he thinks about the things that he's lost, and he grapples with how much he's going to take with him from here on. Once alone, he sat on the bed and opened his traveling apothecary. With both hands, Samir took out each vial, uncorking and smelling its contents. The bergamot oil and grapefruit accord reminded him of the day of discovery at the Ittar shop. The rose evoked a conversation with his grandfather. The vetiver reminded him of the Ayurvedic remedies concocted by his mother. The sandalwood belonged to his father and the ambrette seed to his uncle. Each vial was a solace, and for a while Samir indulged in the familial habit of smelling and adorning, surrendering to fragrance as he'd been trained to do. He cradled home in the same way that he hoped it would cradle him in exile, for it would have to be within his heart, deep within the pumping, beating, fist-size organ that a new Lahore would need to somehow sprout.
Thank you so much. Also, this book is about majorly, I would think, about family. Of course, there's a love story, and of course, there are historical events that shape everyone's lives. But essentially, this book is about two families and how their course of lives change. So when you write about family, there's so much. I think there's a lot that is unsaid. There's a lot that's said that you said earlier. We don't express, we don't talk, and yet you put in, like, I remember the scene when Somnath gives Vivek that journal when he's going to battle, and that absolutely broke me. It's at the beginning of the book, but it's so important, because here's a father. When fathers don't express their love for their sons, they don't talk about it. It's very unsaid. It's very subtle, not even subtle, I don't know what it is. It's very complicated. But here's this book that it goes all out and yet doesn't, when it comes to family and love and togetherness, and it's just so much is so unsaid. So the idea of this being about two families instead of two individuals, why so?
I don't know, that's a good question, because it is a family story, and it is multiple generations of a family. I guess in one way, the love story is at the heart of it. But the relationships on the other side, Samir's relationship with his uncle Vivek, who goes to war, Samir's relationship with Firdaus, who he falls in love with, her father, who happens to be his calligraphy teacher, Firdaus's relationship with her mother, Vivek's relationship with his father. I think it's quite normal, like this family system is what we exist in, right? But I think what is interesting to me is the passage of memory and history down the generations. Who inherits what? Who tells the story? Who is left carrying the story? I think this is probably the heart of what I was interested in, and maybe things are not always meant to come full circle with things. These are two families that exist very intimately with each other until partition, and because of partition, they are drawn apart. And yet, their paths parallel and intersect in unknown ways, even though one exists in Pakistan after partition and the other in France. Maybe memory is also a way for family to hold on to things where everything need not be said, even though it can be felt and inferred. But I'm interested in these small nuances. The larger arc is interesting, but what is interesting is also the intimacy of gesture, of silence, of knowing but not saying, of wanting to say but can't say, of saying and regretting. I think a lot of these characters grapple with keeping history, passing on history.
I wanted to read one small portion where Samir and Firdaus meet for the first time. I think
When Samir and Firdaus meet, they're very young. They are like 9 and 8 or 10, something like that. And they meet in the perfume shop when Firdaus's father, who is a calligrapher, comes to buy rose essence for a paper he's making. He's trying to make a handmade paper to write on. And Samir is in the back, he's wiping little bottles with water. Because he's an apprentice now, he does all the little like side wala kaam. He's cleaning the shelves, he's wiping the bottles, he's rearranging things. He's not doing any important work yet. So half a year into his apprenticeship, Samir was crouched on the ground at the back of the shop, obscured behind a glass cabinet. He drowned each bottle in a bowl of hot water and then, using his fingernails, peeled off the gummy, worn-out labels. Each perfume or ingredient in the bottle bore a simple black and white label, which was not exactly beautiful, for a functional element of business. He had barely gotten through half the lot when he stopped. Bottle still in hand, he inhaled deeply with closed eyes as a new smell snaked around him. Everything about it was ordinary, and yet something stood out so clearly that he was unable to ignore it. He smelled her before he saw her. Lifting his nose above the curtain of his already perfumed environment, he detected rose and orange peels mixed with multani mitti and gram flour. These were the ingredients for uptan, the ordinary face mask applied by women. Someone had walked into the shop carrying the remnants of uptan. But there was something else, something extraordinary that adhered to this ordinary smell. It was musky, warm, soft, calming. Yes, it was also sweet. Immediately he recalled a bottle of the same substance from a faraway island called Haiti, a highly prized ingredient called vanilla, which his uncle pronounced as vanille and his father as vanilla. Could it be? Samir dropped the bottle in water and smelled further, eyes still closed. Hints of something vaguely smoky folded into his nostrils. Was it leather or pepper? No, neither. It was more rudimentary, denser, warmer, ashy, like coal. Allowing this composition to expand his smile and also, it seemed, his heart, he took another deep inhale. Most redolent within this bouquet was the rose, effortlessly overpowering everything else, for a rose could never hide. And just as he brought his nose down from the air, he found a pair of pistachio-colored eyes staring at him through the rows of glass bottles. It was her, the wearer. It was her.
And now, because it is you, I'm going to open it to the audience to ask you questions, because I know it's going to take some time. So, anybody who wants to ask questions to Aanchal, there. We've got there, 1, 2, 3. The mic. Excuse me.
Mic?
Hi, mic to them. Yeah, to the person there. Yeah.
Hello. Aanchal ma'am, I just wanted to know, like, whenever I read about partition and the stories about separation of the two nations, I'm already in a trance of dilemma, and a sort of somberness seeps in whenever I read about stories of partition and the accounts of people who had to go through these different what should I say, the different breaking of two nations. So whenever you were going through these accounts, or you were doing your research, did you have to go through that same state of seriousness that seeps in, and how did you separate your mind from that and then get to working? Because partition is a deep and serious thing that impacts us all, and to come out of it requires a great deal of courage. How did you go about it?
Over the last 10 years, I've written 3 books on partition, so obviously I had to be in it. I don't think there's any way you can be completely objective about what you're writing because they're real people's real stories and you're writing about memory, which defeats objectivity in some way. But you said the word seriousness, and these testimonies are quite serious because you have to take care of them. It's a privilege to listen to them, but then you also have an innate responsibility to do justice to the way in which you present them and what they mean for future generations.
Person then.
Hi, my name is Dev. Aanchal, you said that you have to be at a place to be able to write about it. How about emotions? Do you have to experience them as well before you can write about them?
It's a great question. But I think with the place, it's a bit specific. If you're writing about something, in my opinion, you have to see it. Many writers don't think that, and that's also fine. With the emotion, I think you'll always draw from your own life in some way, right? You may not directly have gone to battle, but you can try and imagine what it would have felt like. You may not have ever lost anybody, but you may have heard someone around you talking about losing a parent or losing a grandparent or a friend, and that may impact your narrative. But to be honest, I don't know if I'm such an imaginative person, which is why I find it very necessary to actually draw from the relationships in my life. So everything small like dates, birthdays, physical characteristics, quirks, they are all of people that I know because I think in some way it makes it a little more grounded for me.
Thank you. I think the person there. And then that one. Yeah, this side.
Aanchal, I have read your earlier book on partition remembrance, very well written. And I see that you have covered not only 47 partition, but 71 also.
Yes.
And it covers various cities and people, including Hyderabad also. Now, why did you choose only Lahore as the starting point?
Such a great question. Two of my grandparents were from there. And I think in nonfiction, there is a necessity to cover more ground, depending on the interviews you're recording. When I'm writing nonfiction, my intention is very different. What I'm hoping to give to my audience is quite different. When you're writing fiction, at least for me, I want to sink into the narrative. I want to be there. When I was writing the novel, it took me a long time to get into the landscape, but when I was there, it took me a long time to get out. Plotting it in Lahore was perhaps a bit of a sentimental thing because two of my grandparents are from there, and they were never able to return to that city or see what had happened to their homes. They burned down in a fire in June 1947, along with many other people's homes. But I think maybe it was a way, not closure, but it was a way to see a beginning, someone else's beginning that impacted my present. Yeah, thank you.
So my question is maybe related to the earlier questions. You said that you went to Lahore and you picturized all those things. How did you picturize the 1930 Lahore with the present day Lahore? So how did you picturize that?
I was very privileged enough to have recorded oral history interviews over the last 10 years, some of which were from people who lived in Lahore. So, and of course, present day I've been myself, so I'm able to make a comparison of the change in geography and landscape, but also the changes particularly after partition. So I think it's only because of the work I did earlier that I was able to write with as much detail and nuance about Lahore as I did in this novel. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Aanchal. Two-part question, really. The first one is that I know you do a lot of research being a historian. So was there anything in particular that while you were researching that really stuck out to you, that like really made you feel something? If there's one thing that you could speak about. And the second one is if you have any other recommendations of books apart from yours, of course, for about the topic of partition itself that you would like to recommend to the people who are sitting here.
I think for the first part of your question, the soldiers' letters are something that I did not expect feeling so emotional about, because I went in with the preconceived notion that these were letters about war, when in fact they are letters about anything but. You go in thinking people are writing about death, but in fact they're writing about life, and they're writing about memory, and they're writing about the things that they cannot see anymore, like the shehnai that they used to play in their village, or the friend that they're telling don't enlist, it's not what you think, or someone who is trying to figure out a land matter sitting in France, but the land is in Lialpur, and he's trying to like figure it out with his family over letters. Or the person who writes to his brother and says, have you killed my parrot yet? Don't kill him, take care of him. You know, things like this, they're very human things. And it really shows you that beneath the layer of weaponry, warfare, everything that they witnessed, there was really a level of humanity and longing as well. And I think I was very moved by the letters. And a lot of the things that Vivek writes in his journals are drawn from those letters. So that's your first question. Your second question about literature around partition, there's so much really. But the one, maybe a few books that I return to again and again are Anis Kidwai's In Freedom's Shade, translated from the Urdu Azadi Ki Chhaaw Mein, work by Ritu Menon, Urvashi Butalia, Anam Zakaria.
Yeah, anyone else? There, the person there, please.
Thank you, Aanchal, for all your work on partition. I just wondered, from a writing perspective, how different it was for you to write about partition in non-fiction and fiction, and what were the differences, but what also were the similarities?
Only a partition historian would ask a question like that, Kavita. Kavita Puri's work, also looking at partition from the British perspective, something that Britain is reckoning with at the moment. But really great question, actually. Vivek started the conversation by saying that this was not a partition novel, and I want people to see it as a novel that has partition in it, along with other things. So the question really was, what do I keep that is necessary to this particular family or the two families narrative? And what do I take out? Because, you know, when we are writing about nonfiction, the intention is to present a diversity of experiences around partition, because there's no one way to receive or talk about partition. It's important to also see how different landscapes were affected by the same event and how memory settles into people differently. But with this case, I think the geography had been narrowed down for me quite a bit already. It was Lahore. Within Lahore, it was the two localities of around Sunheri Masjid and Shahalmi Gate that the two families resided in, and I focused very much on the riots, not just the violence, but also things like parades and stuff that happened around that, and to go from a big scale to a small scale, I think it was very important. It gave me some structure. But then also to pick the kind of events you want to talk about. Here is an opportunity to allow history to settle into fiction in a way that I think stays with people for longer sometimes. If I think of the first stories of partition that people read, they were all novels. And they really build the base of our understanding of partition. Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, Jhoota Sach, Toba Tek Singh, Ismat Chugtai, stuff like that. And so here was an opportunity to not just discuss the incredible gore and violence of partition, but also the incredible loss and separation that happened, the very human things that people like you and me try to bring to the fore in our nonfiction as well.
Thank you. Myself, Abu Tariq. Mine is not a question but an observation that you said about memory. So my grandfather only in his family who stayed in India, all his brothers and sisters went to Pakistan. So when today, these days, we are talking to our uncles, so they told about that our village at that point of time, the all the structures that was made at that point of time, the pull, one-sided pull that was till recently that was built again. I'm just sharing my experience because you have said about memory. So that memory, people keep that memory and they think that the structure is still the same, but that changes a lot. So that's my observation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Because I have one for you about the dialogues in the book, right? They come, of course, because the book is set at a certain time. So, how difficult or easy was it for you to struggle, or or was it very simple to write the dialogues? Because I can never write dialogue. Even in my memoir, it was such a big challenge to write portions that consisted of conversations. So, how does that work for you?
I think only by embodying the character. There are a few things I employ when I write, even in my nonfiction, but specifically in my fiction. Um, I try to become, this is why I draw so much from reality. Someone asked that question. I try to sit inside the character. And you realize in fiction that characters go against what you actually intended for them to do. It's something really weird that doesn't happen in nonfiction. When I'm writing dialogues, I read them out loud in any of the languages that they are written. If I can read them, I do the accents. I read everything out loud when I write, but particularly dialogue because it's like it is what is being said. But I think I wait for, it's complicated. How do I write? Ideas come to me either right before I'm going to sleep or when I'm in the shower. These are the two places because your mind is kind of not really thinking about it. And when it's a scene will come to me. This is very often how it happens. A scene will come to me, I feel myself in the scene, and then I start to begin my dialogue. I want my dialogue to be natural to the time that it's from. So whether it is a dialogue between a husband and a wife who have just heard a radio broadcast about the 1965 war, or it is a dialogue between a grandfather and a granddaughter in 2017 after they've just had a little dance in Paris. I want it to be authentic to the time. What I don't find helpful is reading other dialogues. So I don't know. It's kind of like asking where does the story come from, right?
Yeah, which I'm sure a lot of people ask you.
A story doesn't come fully formed though. Like there's no way that a story that spans 80 to 100 years would come fully formed to you in one go. It is like a block. It's like a building block. You shape it over time. Sometimes over months, other times over years. Other times you replace the blocks for something else. Things in your present day that happen find themselves into the novel at the time when you least expect them to. Sometimes you put them on purpose. But I think it's very important to understand the terrain of a novel as being an undulating, always changing, able to accept, receive, absorb, and also give at the same time. I don't like to think of a novel as finite.
No, of course. But also in the 5 years that it took you to write this book, were there moments when you thought that you just would not be able to move with the book? There are times that because of so much time and effort and emotion and soul put into it, there are times when you think that, how am I going to do this? How am I going to write this? How am I going to take this forward with these characters? What's going to happen now? Did that happen to you, or it was all smooth and
No, it was never smooth, but I never had the thought that I was not going to finish it. I don't write for the purpose of just writing it and keeping it on the side. I knew very much that I would finish the novel. It is for publication.
You just described me, but sure.
Huh?
No, I said you just described me, but
No, but a lot of people do that, and it takes us. There are all kinds of writers, right? People write, and sometimes they have 5 novels. But I find it very difficult to do that. For me, a purpose of writing is to create a product that, I suppose, which will be interpreted by the public as they wish. But I write very much for the purpose of that. So there was never a question of the fact that the novel wouldn't go anywhere. But like normal people, like normal writers, of course, there's writer's block and you have roadblocks. The fortunate thing for me, which I actually don't advise anyone to ever do, is work on 2 books at the same time. And more so, have them be 2 different genres and about completely different things, which keeps your interest in one way, but also really complicates your life. So I remember working on my nonfiction, giving it a break for a couple of months, going back to the novel, working on that for a few months, going back to the nonfiction, editing it, then editing the novel. I don't know, I read somewhere it was actually in Virginia Woolf's husband, Leonard Woolf, his autobiography, where he wrote about Virginia, she's a friend, Virginia
Spiritual
Woolf.
friend.
No, working on different genres simultaneously. He said, Virginia is the only one I know who works on different genres simultaneously, going from fiction to criticism. And it allows her not just a fresh perspective, but he said something like utilizing different parts of her brain, because I think that's very much true. When you're working on different genres and you want to give yourself entirely to both genres, you have to employ different parts of your brain because the intention for writing that piece is different in both genres.
Thank you. Of course, it makes sense. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah.
Hi, Aanchal. A lot of writers here at JLF and otherwise have said that once you're writing fiction, you have a basic foundation of the character, but at some point the characters get away from you and you end up chasing them and try to figure out where they want to take the story. Given the format of your book, the story, the real events that form the backdrop of your story, how much of freedom did you allow your characters? And was there like a lot more control that you exercised over your characters compared to, let's say, a fiction novel that isn't set against the partition or World War One?
I think the character is the only thing you have control over, right? Because if you're like me and you're not interested in creating a whole new world, but going with the one that has already existed, your character is the only one where it's the only malleable thing. But that being said, I was wholly unprepared for that. Because my characters in my nonfiction, my protagonists, are real people with real memory, and there's no malleable, there's no space for change there. What I record, what I receive is what I present on the page. And there is an ethical responsibility to do that as well. But in fiction, like, you can't predict anything. I don't think I was prepared for this much control being given. Like, it was so difficult to understand that the character that I have conceived in my head is going against its best intentions, because the narrative is allowing itself to do that. One of the woman that Samir falls in love with, Firdaus, she was always going to be a secondary character for me when I first conceived of the plot. And over time, I was amazed at the kind of paid space she demanded. She demanded agency, she demanded equality, she demanded to be written more, she demanded to be written deeper, she demanded to be written from different perspectives of the characters that, populated her life, and I was completely unprepared for that. I was prepared for woman writing man. Now, it's very interesting that I had to build an entirely new set of experiences for someone that I had not originally thought would be such a big part of the story, directly. So I think there's a lot of unpredictability in fiction that I had to get used to, allow myself, because essentially you're giving yourself the freedom to do something you never did before, which is be in control of the character.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. Yes, please. The person there.
Hi, Aanchal. The interviews we've conducted over the past 10 years, all partition interviews are about loss. So I wanted to ask, how does the loss that you learned about in those interviews translate to this work and, sit in this landscape of fiction?
Sometimes I wish it wasn't so much about loss, but it actually is. Not just about loss of land, of course, but simple things also. Loss of habits, loss of identity, love, friendship, family, your daily route to work, everything that comes with a sense of exile, which is of course imbued in loss and grief, finds its way into the book. And actually, I wish that wasn't the case, because I really wanted to write something that that would move away from that, because I encountered, as you know, Rashi, so well in your work as well, we encounter that in when we record people's stories, even if they are talking about a happy memory, it is with the knowledge that this memory is lost to a particular kind of partition of time. Go. Novel is all about loss, I think. Basic thing.
Thank you so much, Aanchal, for this. It was great being in conversation
Thank you
with
so
you. And
much.
everyone, please go buy her book. Read it. Read it slowly. Read it. Take your time with it. Read it patiently. It's a beautiful work. Thank you very much.
And with that, we would like to thank Aanchal Malhotra and Vivek Tejuja for this riveting session. Authors will be signing their books at the book signing desk located just outside Darbar Hall.